Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back. My name is Matthew Anderson. I'm the European Culture Editor of the New York Times, and it's my great pleasure to join you for this panel on gender and the arts, crises and correctives. I think that the video that we've just seen sets the tone for the discussion really well. It's no surprise to anyone here to hear that there is a problem of representation in the world of the arts. It's something we've been hearing about since the 1960s. Artists have been dealing with it in their work since then, and increasingly it's a topic of conversation, something that we're talking about all the time in institutions, in the press, and in forums like this. But if you have a look actually at some of the data, for all of this talk, the picture still remains pretty grim. So in the UBS Art Market Report, which just came out quite recently, it's the most sort of authoritative report on what's happening in the art market. The figure of representation of galleries, so the galleries represent, the artists that they represent make up just over a third. Acquisition into museums is much lower. By one estimate, it's only 10% of all acquisitions in the United States in the last decade. And one figure that I found which sort of really blew my mind came from the Burns-Halperin report, which says that since 2008, at auction, sales of works by one artist alone, Picasso, have been greater than by all of the female artists that were surveyed. So I think there's a sense that we're talking about this a lot, but then perhaps action which might actually correct the situation is lagging behind. And to discuss this issue, I'm joined by a great panel who can look at this from several different perspectives. We have Rochelle Lehmann from the gallery Lehmann Maupin, an international gallery which represents many women artists. Christian Levett, an art collector based here in Florence, who has a significant collection of women artists, particularly in the area of abstract expressionism, and Dajani, a Palestinian actress and poet whose work addresses many themes of inequality, but particularly the position of women and the empowerment of women as well. So I wanted to start, maybe if we could just go back to those figures. I don't want to start on too much of a downer note, but I think also this discussion is premised on the fact that there is a problem. Rochelle, maybe I could start by asking you, do you think that those figures show that we're doing something wrong, or in all of this talk and our efforts to fix it, or do you think that we just need to be patient and that we're heading in the right direction and that the change that we're looking for will come eventually?
So it's a hit and miss question. We are doing something right. We are not doing enough of the right, and the question is why? And the question is how long, right?
First of all, maybe you could say what you think that we're doing right and what we're not doing enough of.
So let me give you some positive news. The positive news is if you look at biennials, and particularly if you look at the Whitney Biennial, you have since 2012 to 2022, the participation of women slowly but steadily rose from 28% to 48%. When you look at the last Venice Biennial by Cecilia Alemani here in Italy, in Venice, it was over 80% women, and it was really a statement. So we're doing something right. We're doing a lot wrong. Here is what we're doing wrong. I would say that it's going to take, I'm going to give the bad news right away. I think it's going to take a long time, and we have to start quickly rethinking education and political initiative and the press in it. So what is really happening today is that the buying power is still with men. Men buy art, men buy male art. It is female buyers who really there are some exceptions to my right, and I acknowledge it, but there are very rare exceptions. Thank you for being here. But it is female collectors, and I can talk to you from my perspective. It is female collectors who support my gallery, who support the many artists, female artists we represent. It has been always a huge goal for us, representing artists from all geographies, but in particular give a platform for female artists. So going back to you, I think when I'm saying education and the economists in the rooms are going to kill me, I think it's going to start by doing what some Nordic countries are doing. Paternity, maternity leave, a prolonged one. I'm going to say something which is absolutely not done in the United States. It's a political initiative, right? It's through education, through that role which is being really shared, and through that little baby which is growing, where he or she sees equally the division between tasks, but also responsibility between female and male, we can start changing something. So it's gonna take a while, it's gonna take some time, but again, on the positive side, political countries have understood a long time ago that the power is with female. And if you see what's happening in Iran, when you see in other countries how women are being cherished and celebrated, I think in a strange way we need political change, but politicians also are the ones who acknowledge that change and power to women, and therefore in the art world as being a soft power is essential.
Donna, perhaps I could bring you in there, because you are an activist as well as an artist, and you work on the intersection of literature, performance, film, but you're not specifically part of the art world as such in terms of the visual art world of galleries, museums, etc. I wonder what you thought of Rochelle's idea that really the way you're going to change the art world is by changing the world around it first.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that just came to my mind when we're talking about education, I did a performance recently, impromptu performance in Florence a couple of nights ago, and I met a stand-up comedian, and we were talking about why we're here. I mentioned the panel, and he had an interesting story to share. He said that on Women's Day, one of the venues that he works with wanted to do an open mic for women, but there were only 2 female comedians in Florence, and he reached out to those 2 female comedians, and both of them happened to already be booked on Women's Day. So what is the opportunity here? Is to reach out to those 2 women who are potential leaders in the community and empower them with a venue, with education, with resources to then train the next generation. So the performing arts, literature, poetry need as much endowment and patronage as the visual arts. We have all of these statistics because we can measure what's in galleries. It's quite measurable. Yet we need to go out into communities and start measuring the resources that are lacking in our communities and those which are available, so we know what we can tap into and what we can nurture, so we can develop the missing links.
Christian, maybe if I could bring you in here. You are a man who does collect arts by women, and primarily so that's the main focus of a large part of your collection. But I'm kind of interested by, I think that sometimes we have a sense of an idea that we're just on it's maybe assumed by my first question to Rochelle that we're just on this continuum really, and that if we just bear with it, we're moving in the right direction. But I'm kind of interested also in how things can also happen in fits and starts. So for instance, you collect a lot of work by abstract expressionists and a lot of those are being rediscovered at the moment, and they're often spoken about as forgotten women artists. But that implies that we knew who they were at one stage. Say Lee Krasner, who is an artist who you have, Helen Frankenthaler, they were a reasonably big deal in their life, but they just didn't become part of the established story of abstract expressionism. And I wonder if through the experience of having your collection, if you have any thoughts about what we can do to make sure that that doesn't happen in the future, that we sort of keep the work of women artists part of the established history of art.
Yeah, you know, I think things are changing pretty rapidly now. I think the statistics that you quote are as bad as they are, mostly because historically there just hasn't been that many women artists as compared to men, and the further you go back in time, it dwindles, to almost nothing if we get back to, the Renaissance and the Baroque period. But if we look at the more recent period, the abstract expressionist period, which was an art movement that formed largely in New York during the 1940s, and continued through to about 1960 and had its heyday throughout the 1950s. It started with a show, or was launched, if you like, with a show in 1951, the 9th Street Exhibition, and there were 75 artists in that show, only 11 of which were women. So even 70 years ago, there was still a huge dominance of male art over female. So when auction houses, for example, do auctions today, they're still dominated mostly by male artists, because historically there's just been more male artists than female that were active for all the sort of social and religious reasons, if we go back far enough, that we know. But I think today that is changing, as Rochelle sort of touched upon with recent biennials. Many galleries, many museums are now evening the sort of the amount of shows that are done between males and females. And if you look at the market today, there's probably as many female artists on the market as male artists in the sort of contemporary world.
But they don't sell for as much, do they? That's definitely. I mean, Rochelle, you would know about that.
First of all, as you pointed, I want to give an ugly number. 3% out of 186 billions of publicly sold artworks are only of females. I want to add a caveat to it, right? So it's 62% from 186, right? But what is more worrisome for me, and I don't have an answer for it, if you look at the NFT market, which is a very recent market, right? I'm not pro, I'm not against. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about NFTs. I know definitely that it has, as blockchain, a place at to some extent, but under 5% of NFTs sold was by women. I mean, this is telling a story. This is yesterday. This is not 70s. This is not last century. This is yesterday. Why is the question? And I think it's a bigger, again, I'm going back to responsibilities. I am going back to the market, to the buying market, but also to responsibility of the press. I think we have to talk about some realities. We have to ask ourselves, why is it happening? Is it because women don't trust themselves? Do we need to create more role models? Is it going to be the next generation? But 5% of NFTs only by female is quite an ugly story.
Yeah, that's pretty shocking.
Dana, in terms of the idea of creating role models or creating models for empowerment, is that something that you think about in your work? It seems to me the Caged Bird, which you're going to perform for us afterwards, to me that seems to have a very strong message of individual empowerment. Is that a sort of goal of your work?
Yeah, well, Caged Bird, I won't be performing since you've just seen the video, and I just wanted to shout out my husband, Ramikanso, who animated the work with me over the course of a year. But in producing this work, the poem is written from the perspective that one can say it quite obviously, it's a possessive sort of romantic relationship. But in the visual aesthetic, I wanted to portray obviously, she's a woman of means, a woman of wealth. There's a lot of literary references within the film, so you can see that she's a well-read woman, but when she's not given the agency to move freely and act in society, she's rendered impotent. No matter how well educated, no matter how well, funded she might be, she needs to be given agency to act. When we talk about role models, Sheikh al-Mayasa is an incredible role model, and I would say icon of, in terms of an Arab woman in the arts, and we definitely need more, particularly in the Middle East, to say, this is a path worth pursuing. When I decided to study theater, my parents protested vehemently. They said there is no pride for our daughter to be on a stage. And of course, when I studied, it was, pre-Instagram and pre-TikTok, and now everyone is somewhat on a stage. And so it's become a lot more socially acceptable and accessible to see and be seen. Now we have to consider, what are we showing on these social media platforms? What kind of values, what kind of art or production, and giving the space for more cultivated messages instead of just immediate reactionary posts.
I wonder if we could consider, we've been talking about sort of art, women's art necessarily as just art which a woman has produced, but I think there's also a very strong strain of art within the art world which addresses directly the experience of being a woman, which is not just art which is by a woman, but which is about being a woman. And I wondered if, Rochelle, from your experience, does that have an effect on the kind of prices of, or the desirability of art? So, for instance, abstract expressionism, that's about form and color and whatever, but it doesn't actually address the experience of being a woman. Would you find it easier to find collectors who look for that kind of art rather than art which addresses a directly political experience of womanhood?
So I would like to quote an artist who I work with, who is a male artist, Kada Attia, who curated the last Berlin Biennial. And the reason he does art as well, because he's such a big thinker and philosopher, he says because art creates emotions, and it is through emotion that we can communicate that something that we cannot communicate otherwise, hence soft power. So to answer your question, good art has somewhere an emotional power, right? And having this emotional power comes from who the artist is. There is always a personal story. The artist, if it's abstract, if it's figurative, if it's performance art, if it's installation art, there is always a part of the artist, of the personality of the artist, kind of an auto-portrait in the artwork. So to answer your question, I think what you're referring to is something a little bit different. Women were telling a personal story in a way which is more emotional, because there was a bigger need to tell that story. Would they be more neutral, more emotionless? Would it be more successful? Would it sell for more money? Maybe, but it wouldn't last. It wouldn't be good art.
So we'll take some questions from the floor in a moment. But Christian, I wanted to ask you, we've heard that most collectors are male, and that Rochelle sees that as a big problem in terms of how we can create a market for women artists. But what draws you as a male collector to concentrate your collection on the work of women artists? Is it a political thing? Is it aesthetic? Or is it kind of a combination of both?
Yeah, no, it's definitely not political, actually, to the artist's credit. You know, I've created in a number of collections. I collect antiquities, old masters, and in the last 10 years I've been collecting female abstract expressionists. The thing that really sort of attracted me to that area was the quality of the artworks by artists that had been overlooked. 2 or 3 less so, namely Joan Mitchell, Lee Krasner, and Helen Frankenthaler, which is discussing price, we're trading at about 1/10 of the price or 1/15 of the price of a Willem de Kooning or Jackson Pollock or Mark Rothko. And then there was another huge step down to 10% of their prices to the sort of the next level artists of Elaine de Kooning and Grace Hartigan, who were also major artists of the abstract expressionist period. And then there was another major group of artists where the prices were another, let's say, third below those. So many of these pictures, if not all of them, depending on, you know, sort of matching pictures and matching artists, are equally as good as some of the male artists or many of the male artists of the period. And yet trading at one tiny, tiny fraction of the price. And many of these pictures had been shown in the major galleries of the 1940s and 1950s, as shown with Peggy Guggenheim in the 40s, as shown with Betty Parsons in the 50s, Tibor Denage in the 50s, the Stable Gallery in the 50s, often had labels on the back of the pictures, had often been in major shows at museums like the Whitney, the Guggenheim, SF MoMA on the West Coast, etc. So here was this fairly large number of artworks on the market with absolutely blockbuster provenance, absolutely exquisite pictures at what, at least to me, were accessible prices. That was impossible amongst the male artists. So what sort of drove me to build this collection was, first of all, a love of the arts. They were high-quality pieces, and if you read the words of the artists, the female artists themselves of the period, they weren't looking necessarily to sort of compete with the men. They didn't really have a sort of thinking about sort of the gender situation at the time. They just wanted to create great artworks. That was their only personal agenda. Here we are sort of, you know, in the last 10 years, and a lot of these artworks were on the market. Some of the artists were sort of not exactly undiscovered. They were still being represented, their estates, by, let's say, mid-level New York galleries rather than the major ones. So the artworks were out there, and it was just an opportunity within a fairly short space of time to put together a museum-quality collection of artworks at what to me was an accessible price level, and artworks that have mostly been, or many of which have been museum exhibited in the past, certainly been in the major galleries of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and to create history at an accessible price.
So just to turn ourselves towards the future briefly before we take a couple of questions from the floor, I think that people often say, oh, it's quite easy to fix problems about representation, and the way you do it is by bringing in quotas. In institutions, in education institutions, museums, what you show, etc. I wanted to ask, but it's not something that we do though, because there are arguments on both sides. I want to ask both of the women on the panel, just briefly, where do you stand on the idea of quotas in museums, in education programs, or even in the makeup of panels like we're doing this afternoon? Rochelle?
I'd like to add something to it. I don't think it's enough. And it helps a little, but I'll give you an example. I know that Adam Weinberg is sitting in the room, and the Whitney was very good with giving a platform to female artists when they are young or mid-career, right? But this is not the case. Even if you give quotas, to answer your question, many museums, for example, show female artists when the artists are dead or almost dead. And I can give you some examples, you know, Carolina Herrera, Agnes Martin, Bourgeois, etc., In my own stable, Cecilia Vicuña has been working from the 60s and started getting attention in 2017. She was over 60 years old. Same for Helen Pashkin, who started getting attention in her 80s. So quotas are not enough. I think quotas help. It creates awareness, but it's not enough.
And Dana, what about in the world of, say, festival which you might perform, or in terms of putting together programs, what are your thoughts on quotas?
Yeah, I think it's an imperative that we take action towards equal opportunity. There's a triggering word, which is reparations. I don't think reparations are a shameful thing. I think it's a financial adjustment towards creating a more equal, balanced playing field. So I think in that way, women should be patroned. You say 80% of the programming was women. It's not enough. We need years of 95% women's program to start to catch up, because it's not to say that there haven't been female artists throughout history. It's just that they had social obligations and social restrictions and limitations, and if they did shun those obligations, then more often than not they were ostracized and lived on the fringes of their community, and when they died, they left their legacy to no one. So if it did end up in auction, great for the person who ended up making a fortune on her work, but such a tragedy for her who lived a life that was really devoid of community and connection and celebration for her talent. So we can't do much to change the past. We can take steps forward to ensure that the future is one that celebrates the art of tomorrow, which I think is going to be art by women and for women. Just one more thing to add, we have this, I'm a poet, so I'm into semantics. We have this question, is art a way out? But I think art is a way in, and that's what artistic expression has been for women, which is why it's not competitive, which is why it's not about bravado, which is why there hasn't been the need to try and showcase consistently, because it's about the internal process.
That's a great point. We've got time probably for one or two questions, if you keep them brief. Over here, and if you could just say your name at the beginning, please, and who it's the question for. Oh, sorry, there's just a mic just there for you.
Hi, it's Holly again. You mentioned Scandinavia in reference to parental leave and other gender equality aspirations. Norway actually introduced a gender compulsory quota within the law in 2007, a gender balance of 40-60 on the board of all listed companies. Does a top-down approach not seem as an effective and important step, rather than the glacial speed of benchmarks and wishes for the future?
Rochelle, do you want to take that?
So your question is it, can you repeat your question? I heard your summary, but not the question. What is the question, really?
I think I was asking if you're interested in the top-down approach based on your interest in Scandinavia and changes within legislation for quotas and how effective they've proven to be.
I am interested in it. You have a similar, by the way, a similar policy, I believe, in Canada, with a lot of criticism, which, I'm a business owner, so I don't take it lightly from the business community. So I'm interested in it, but I'm not a specialist in it. I'd like to hear more, but I think paternity, maternity leave is really necessary, really, really necessary. Even not for gender equality, but for the general health of mental health, right? So I think it's a big question, and I'm for it.
We've got time for one more question from the floor. No? In that case, I'm going to ask everyone just quickly, what is the one thing that you think will have the most effect on turning this situation around? Rochelle, you seem to think it's paternity, maternity leave, all the way that we...
It's politics, yeah. It's politics, it's education, and press. I can't say enough. There's a lot of things the press does not talk about. We talk about numbers, we get buzzwords. It has to, social media press, it has to be a constant, visible issue and discussion. So press and politics.
Christian?
Yeah, I think that plus exhibiting the artworks when we're talking about art itself. So there's an exhibition that's currently on at the Whitechapel Gallery Museum in London, which showcases 80 abstract female artists who were painting between 1940 and 1970. It's only got 3 weeks to run, then it goes to the Fondation Van Gogh in Arles for the summer, and then the Kunsthalle Bielefeld near Dortmund in Germany for next winter. So that's a sort of seminal show to sort of bring a renaissance again to female abstract expressionism, at least, that's touring Europe. And then there's been other shows this year, in the last 12 months, that have shown the female abstract expressionists against the male ones that have been in Berlin, at the Albertina in Vienna. There's currently one at the Munch Museum in Oslo, and then there's one that opens at the Artisan Museum in Japan on June the 2nd. So there's certainly a lot of exhibitions out there right now which are leveling up the playing field, at least in mid-20th century art, between the males and the females, and or showcasing just the female arts. So, and they're shows which are getting a tremendous amount of media attention in their own countries. So all the major newspapers in the UK, actually several of them in the US, have covered the Whitechapel show, for example, and that will continue in France and Germany, and has happened in Austria and Germany earlier last year. So I think exhibiting the art encourages more media, encourages more collectors to collect the female art, and so I think exhibitions is key.
Dana, what do you think is the one thing that we can all do that's going to make the most difference in this question?
You know, I speak for myself perhaps, but I think I'm quite shy. I'm confident, but I'm still quite shy. And I bet many of your female colleagues, fellow artists, creative, are also quite shy. So promote their work, push it, because they're going to feel too self-conscious to push it themselves. Really push their work, promote it, empower female curators and gallerists to look for the quiet ones, because they're the ones who need amplification.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much to all of my panelists for a fantastic discussion.